It starts with a headline that feels almost impossible to process. A licensed business owner, operating within a regulated industry, suddenly facing one of the most serious charges in the legal system: terrorism. Not a regulatory violation, not a licensing issue, but terrorism. And when something like this happens, the immediate reaction is confusion, because the gap between what people expect and what the law ultimately allows can be much wider than most realize. But here's the question: did this situation truly meet the legal definition of terrorism, or are we looking at a case where the law is being applied in a way that raises deeper constitutional concerns? I want you to think about that carefully and share your perspective in the comments below. Now, to understand what's really going on here, we have to step away from the headline and start with the facts, because in cases like this, the details are everything. According to publicly available legal records and reporting standards typically followed in cases of this nature, charges labeled as terrorism are not applied casually. They usually require specific legal thresholds to be met, including intent, connection to broader criminal activity, or actions that are interpreted as threats to public safety at a systemic level. So when a gun store owner is charged under such a classification, it immediately raises two parallel questions. First, what exactly is being alleged? And second, how does that allegation fit within the legal definition required to justify such a charge? In most jurisdictions, including under federal law, terrorism-related charges are tied to statutes that focus on intent, coordination, and impact. It is not enough for an act to simply involve a weapon or a regulated item. The law typically requires a connection to a broader purpose, such as intimidation, coercion, or influencing government or civilian populations. This distinction is critical because owning, selling, or distributing firearms, when done within legal frameworks, is not by itself an act that meets the threshold of terrorism. So something more must be alleged, and that's where cases like this become legally complex. According to standard prosecutorial procedures, when authorities bring a charge of this magnitude, they must present evidence that supports each required element of the statute. That includes not just what happened, but why it happened, and what the intended outcome may have been. However, it's equally important to understand that an allegation is not a conviction. In the United States legal system, every individual is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. Charges represent the beginning of a legal process, not the conclusion of one, and that principle matters more than ever in cases involving serious accusations. Now let's talk about the regulatory environment surrounding gun store ownership, because this provides essential context. Gun store owners operate within one of the most heavily regulated commercial sectors. They are required to maintain licenses, conduct background checks where applicable, keep detailed records, and comply with both federal and state laws. Agencies, such as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, commonly known as the ATF, are responsible for overseeing compliance in this area. According to official regulatory frameworks, violations in this space typically result in administrative penalties, fines, or license revocation. So when a case escalates beyond regulatory enforcement into criminal prosecution, especially under terrorism-related statutes, it signals that authorities believe the situation goes far beyond standard compliance issues. But again, belief and proof are not the same thing. And this is where legal analysis becomes essential. One interpretation is that prosecutors may be applying a broad reading of existing statutes to address conduct they believe poses a serious threat. Another perspective raised in legal discussions is that such applications must be carefully examined to ensure they do not extend beyond what the Constitution allows. In my legal analysis, this is where the balance between enforcement and constitutional protection becomes most visible, because when the government brings a charge, especially one of this magnitude, it must operate within clearly defined legal boundaries. Courts would likely examine whether the alleged conduct satisfies the statutory definition of terrorism, not in a general sense, but in a precise and legally structured way. They would also evaluate whether the application of the law aligns with constitutional protections, including due process under the Fifth Amendment. Due process ensures that individuals are not deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures. In a case involving serious criminal charges, that includes the right to a fair trial, the right to legal representation, and the requirement that the government prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Additionally, depending on how the investigation was conducted, Fourth Amendment considerations may also come into play. If evidence was obtained through searches or seizures, courts would likely examine whether those actions complied with constitutional standards. Were proper warrants obtained? Was probable cause established? Were procedures followed correctly? These are not minor technicalities. They are foundational requirements that shape whether a case can move forward. Now, let's step back and consider the broader legal framework. Terrorism, as defined under federal law, generally involves acts that are dangerous to human life and intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence government policy. That definition includes both domestic and international components. But it also requires intent. And intent is often one of the most difficult elements to prove, because it goes beyond actions and into the mindset behind those actions. In court, intent is not assumed. It must be demonstrated through evidence. This can include communications, documented behavior, patterns of conduct, or other indicators that point toward a specific objective. Without that, the legal threshold may not be met. And that's why cases like this are often closely watched, not just for their outcome, but for how the law is interpreted along the way. Because interpretation can shape future enforcement. Now let's talk about the timeline of events, as cases like this typically follow a structured progression. An investigation begins, evidence is gathered, charges are filed, an arrest may occur, and then the case enters the judicial process. At each stage, legal standards must be met. At each stage, the defense has the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's claims. And at each stage, the court acts as the final arbiter of what is legally permissible. This process is designed to ensure fairness, but it also means that early reports may not reflect the full picture. And that's why careful analysis matters, because jumping to conclusions on either side can overlook critical details that only emerge over time. So as we continue through this breakdown, the focus remains on one objective: understanding what is alleged, how the law applies, and what this case could mean moving forward. Because in legal matters, clarity doesn't come from headlines. It comes from examining the facts, the law, and the process, step by step. Now, as we move deeper into this case, the focus shifts from the existence of the charge to the structure of the allegation itself. Because in any serious criminal case, especially one involving terrorism statutes, the narrative presented by prosecutors is built step by step, not just around what happened, but around how each action connects to a legal requirement. According to standard legal procedure, the prosecution must establish a clear chain of events. This typically begins with identifying the conduct in question, what actions were taken, when they occurred, and who was involved. Then comes the interpretation of those actions, because actions alone are not enough. The law requires context. For example, if authorities allege that certain items were sold, transferred, or distributed in a way that violated legal standards, the next question becomes whether those actions were routine business conduct or something that falls outside lawful activity. And that distinction is not always obvious at first glance. According to how cases of this nature are generally structured, investigators would likely examine transaction records, communication logs, compliance documentation, and any relevant interactions that could indicate whether procedures were followed. They may also analyze patterns. Was this an isolated incident or part of a repeated course of conduct? Because patterns can influence how intent is interpreted. Now, from the prosecution's perspective, one possible argument could be that the actions in question were not simply regulatory violations, but part of a broader conduct that they believe meets the legal threshold of a terrorism-related offense. One interpretation is that prosecutors may attempt to demonstrate that the alleged behavior had implications beyond standard business operations. Another perspective raised in courtrooms in similar cases is that such interpretations must be carefully scrutinized to ensure they are not extending criminal statutes beyond their intended scope. And this is where the defense enters the picture, because the defense does not need to prove innocence. Their role is to challenge whether the prosecution has met its burden of proof. They may question the interpretation of evidence. They may challenge how intent is being inferred. They may argue that the actions described, even if factually accurate, do not meet the legal definition required for the charges being applied. In my legal analysis, this is often the central battleground in complex criminal cases. Not what happened, but what those actions legally represent. Because the same set of facts can sometimes support multiple interpretations, and the outcome depends on which interpretation the court ultimately accepts. Now let's take a closer look at the legal definition of terrorism in a more structured way, because understanding this is critical. Under federal law, terrorism-related offenses generally require three key elements. First, there must be an act that is dangerous to human life or violates criminal statutes. Second, the act must appear intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence government policy, or affect government conduct. Third, there must be a connection between the conduct and that intended objective. If any one of these elements is not sufficiently supported by evidence, the charge itself may face serious legal challenges. Courts would likely examine each element independently. They would ask, is there clear evidence of a dangerous act? Is there credible proof of intent? Is there a demonstrable link between the conduct and a broader objective? And importantly, these questions are not answered based on assumptions. They are answered based on evidence presented under strict legal standards. Now let's consider how evidence is evaluated. In criminal cases, evidence must meet certain thresholds of reliability and admissibility. Documents must be authenticated. Statements must be obtained lawfully. Any physical or digital evidence must be collected in accordance with constitutional protections. If evidence is obtained improperly, it may be excluded. And if key evidence is excluded, the strength of the prosecution's case can change significantly. This is where the Fourth Amendment becomes especially relevant. If searches were conducted, courts would likely examine whether warrants were properly issued, whether probable cause existed, and whether the scope of the search remained within legal limits. If any of these standards were not met, the defense may file motions to suppress evidence, and those motions can have a major impact on the direction of the case. Similarly, the Fifth Amendment plays a role in how statements are obtained. If the defendant was questioned, courts would examine whether proper procedures were followed. Were rights clearly communicated? Was any statement given voluntarily? Were there any indications of coercion? These are not just procedural details. They are constitutional safeguards. Now, let's return to the narrative timeline. After charges are filed, the case typically moves into pretrial proceedings. This phase includes hearings, motions, and legal arguments that shape what will ultimately be presented in court. It is during this stage that both sides refine their strategies. The prosecution strengthens its case, the defense identifies weaknesses, and the court evaluates which arguments meet legal standards. In some cases, charges may be reduced, modified, or even dismissed before trial. In others, the case proceeds to a full trial where evidence is presented and evaluated by a judge or jury. And throughout this process, one principle remains constant: the presumption of innocence. Now let's address something that often influences public perception: the language used in charges. Terms like terrorism carry significant weight. They are not just legal classifications. They are also powerful labels that shape how a case is viewed. But in court, labels alone are not enough. What matters is whether the underlying legal criteria are satisfied. In my legal analysis, this distinction is critical, because public reaction is often driven by terminology, while legal outcomes are driven by evidence and statutory interpretation. Now let's explore potential real-world implications. For other gun store owners or individuals operating in regulated industries, cases like this can create concern, not necessarily because they are engaging in unlawful behavior, but because they want to understand where the boundaries are. What conduct is clearly permitted? What actions could raise questions? What standards are being applied, and how might those standards evolve? These are valid questions, and they highlight the importance of clarity in the law, because when legal boundaries are well defined, compliance becomes more achievable. When they are uncertain, risk increases, even for those acting in good faith. This is why regulatory guidance, legal updates, and professional advice play such an important role. Now, let's consider the broader legal landscape. Cases involving serious charges often influence how laws are applied in the future. Even if a case does not result in a conviction, the legal arguments presented can shape how courts interpret similar situations later on. This is how legal precedent develops. One case leads to another. Interpretations evolve. Standards become more defined, and over time, the legal framework becomes more detailed. But that process takes time. And during that time, uncertainty can remain. So as we continue to follow this case, the key is not to rush to conclusions, but to observe how the legal process unfolds. Because each stage reveals more information, each argument adds context, and each ruling brings greater clarity. Now, as we move toward the final layer of this case, everything comes down to how higher courts, especially federal appellate courts and potentially the Supreme Court, would interpret a situation like this if it continues to progress, because at that level, the focus is no longer just on the facts of one individual case. It becomes about legal standards that could apply far beyond it. Courts at that level would not only examine the specific allegations but also ask a broader question. Does applying a terrorism-related statute in this context align with constitutional principles and established precedent? And that's where past Supreme Court decisions begin to matter. While each case is unique, courts often look to prior rulings that define how criminal statutes should be interpreted, especially when intent and classification are central issues. In cases involving serious federal charges, the Supreme Court has consistently emphasized that criminal laws must be applied with precision. Vague or overly broad interpretations can raise constitutional concerns, particularly under due process protections. In my legal analysis, that principle becomes highly relevant here. Because if a statute designed to address terrorism is applied in a way that extends beyond its clearly defined scope, courts would likely examine whether that application remains constitutionally valid. There is a strong constitutional argument that individuals must have clear notice of what conduct is criminal. This concept, often referred to as the void for vagueness doctrine, prevents laws from being enforced in unpredictable or inconsistent ways. So, one of the key questions higher courts may eventually consider is whether the application of the charge provides that level of clarity, or whether it creates ambiguity that could affect future cases. Now, let's consider how intent would be evaluated at that level. As discussed earlier, intent is not assumed. It must be supported by evidence. But when cases reach higher courts, the issue often shifts from what did the evidence show to was the legal standard for evaluating that evidence applied correctly? That distinction is subtle, but important, because appellate courts typically do not re-examine every fact from scratch. Instead, they review how the law was interpreted and whether proper procedures were followed. If they find that a legal standard was misapplied, they can overturn or modify earlier decisions, and that can reshape how similar cases are handled moving forward. Now let's bring in another constitutional dimension, the balance between public safety and individual rights. This balance appears in many areas of law, but it becomes especially sensitive in cases involving serious criminal classifications. On one hand, the government has a responsibility to protect public safety and respond to potential threats. On the other hand, constitutional protections exist specifically to ensure that enforcement does not exceed legal boundaries. One interpretation is that strong enforcement tools are necessary to address evolving risks. Another perspective raised in legal discussions is that those tools must be used carefully, with strict adherence to statutory limits. Because once a legal boundary is expanded in one case, it can influence how the law is applied in others. In my legal analysis, this is where long-term implications begin to take shape. Because cases like this do not exist in isolation. They contribute to a broader legal framework that affects future enforcement, future prosecutions, and future rights. Now let's shift to the practical reality. For individuals and business owners operating within regulated industries, this case highlights an important truth. Compliance is not just about following written rules, but also about understanding how those rules are interpreted and enforced. That means staying informed about legal developments. It means maintaining clear documentation, and it means seeking qualified legal guidance when uncertainty arises. Because as we've seen, the difference between a regulatory issue and a criminal allegation can depend on how conduct is interpreted within a legal framework, and that interpretation can evolve. Now let's also acknowledge something important. Supporters of strong enforcement measures may argue that applying serious charges in certain cases is necessary to deter harmful conduct and maintain public safety. They may believe that broader application of statutes provides flexibility in addressing complex situations. At the same time, critics may argue that expanding legal definitions too far risks undermining the clarity and predictability that the legal system depends on. Both perspectives exist within legitimate legal debate, and courts play a central role in evaluating those competing concerns. Now, as we bring this discussion to a close, it's important to return to where we started, a headline that raises immediate questions, a situation that feels unexpected, and a legal process that is still unfolding. Because at this stage, what we have are allegations, legal arguments, and procedural developments, not a final outcome. And that distinction matters. Because in any legal system grounded in due process, conclusions are reached through evidence, argument, and judicial review, not assumption. So what should you take away from all of this? First, that serious charges require serious evidence. Second, that legal definitions matter, and how they are applied matters even more. And third, that understanding the law is not just about knowing the rules, it's about understanding how those rules are interpreted in real-world situations. Before we end, I want to bring you back into the conversation one more time. Given everything we've discussed, do you think applying terrorism-related charges in a case like this reflects a necessary evolution of the law, or does it risk stretching legal definitions beyond their intended limits? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective is part of a much bigger discussion. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more clear, professional, and fact-based legal analysis, make sure you subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you don't miss upcoming videos. And also tell me in the comments, what topic should we break down next? Because the next video might be based on your question. And remember this: in the legal world, the truth isn't decided by headlines. It's decided by evidence, interpretation, and the rule of law.